on Earth, going all the way back to the very beginnings of the history of life. So, how do you regard, statements like that as simply mythology, or is there perhaps something more to it than that? What I decided to do was make a prediction. Just assume hypothetically that what the ancient Sanskrit writings tell us about human antiquity is true. Assume that hypothetically. Then you could make a prediction. And the prediction I made would be that if that's true, there should be reports of archaeological evidence for humans existing much further back in time than 150,000 years ago, perhaps going back many millions of years. So to test that prediction, here's the methodology that I adopted. I decided I would examine all archaeological reports from the time of Darwin up to the present. And I have a reading knowledge of most of the major European languages, so I didn't look just at reports in the English language, but reports in French, Italian, Spanish, German, so on. And that took me about 8 years to go through the entire published literature related to human antiquity. And I made two basic findings. My first finding is perhaps not so surprising. There are no reports of evidence for extreme human antiquity in the current secondary literature. I divide the scientific literature into two basic groups. Primary literature, by which I mean original reports by investigators published in the professional scientific literature, and then the secondary literature, which is based on the primary literature. Secondary literature would include textbooks, survey studies, things of that sort. So that was my first finding. No reports of archaeological evidence for extreme human antiquity in the current secondary literature, textbooks, for example. Second finding was a little more interesting to me. My second finding was there are many reports of archaeological evidence for extreme human antiquity in the primary scientific literature, past and present. I documented that evidence in this book, Forbidden Archeology. And this book was reviewed in most of the professional journals that deal with human antiquity. Of course, it's a very controversial book, so the opinions expressed about it were varied, ranging from sarcastic derision to grudging acknowledgement that the book did make a contribution. In that category, I include a review, actually not just an ordinary review, but a 23-page review article about the book that appeared in Social Studies of Science by David Oldroyd, a noted historian of science, and his graduate student, Joe Wodak. They asked, has Forbidden Archaeology made any contribution to the literature on paleoanthropology? They answered, our answer is a guarded yes, for two reasons. First, much of the historical material has not been scrutinized in such detail before. David Oldroyd is a historian of science who specializes in human origins and geological studies. And in his opinion, nobody had really gone into the history of archaeology in such depth before. And second, the authors stated. The book, quote, raises a central problematic regarding the lack of certainty in scientific truth claims. Now, scientists attach different levels of certainty to the truth claims in their disciplines. And in the field of archaeology, they attach a very high level of certainty, approaching absolute certainty, to the idea that human beings like us first appeared between 100 and 200,000 years ago. So they thought we had done a good job in problematizing, to some extent, that claim, or that level of certainty attaching to that claim. So he also brought out the book in an abridged popular edition called The Hidden History of the Human Race. And after the book appeared, I began presenting papers based on the substance of the book at international conferences on archaeology, history of science, and related fields. First paper I presented was a paper called Pharaonic Time in the Archaeological Record, which I gave at the World Archaeological Congress meeting that was held in New Delhi in 1994. The World Archaeological Congress meets every 4 years in a different country. So that particular year they happened to meet in India. I thought it would be a good opportunity to speak about Vedic perspectives on human origins. So that paper was published in the peer-reviewed conference proceedings volume, Time in Archaeology, edited by archaeologist Tim Murray, published by Routledge, a major scientific and academic publisher. You know, sometimes people ask me, well, has your work been published in peer-reviewed publications? And, well, the answer is yes. So my question about this evidence for human antiquity, extreme human antiquity, which can be found in the primary scientific literature, is why isn't it found in the secondary literature today? I think it's because of what I call a process of knowledge filtration that operates in the world of science. And here I'm not talking about a satanic conspiracy to suppress truth. I'm talking about something that philosophers of science and historians of science have understood for a long time, namely that theoretical preconceptions can influence how scientists in a particular discipline will react to different categories of evidence that come to their attention. We could call the blue box up there the knowledge filter. We could say it represents the dominant consensus in a knowledge community about a certain topic. So reports of evidence that conform to the dominant consensus will pass through this intellectual filter very easily, which means this evidence will make its way into textbooks, for example. But if there's evidence that radically contradicts a dominant consensus, it tends to be set aside, ignored, forgotten, dismissed on questionable grounds. And I'll go over a few representative cases of the kinds of evidence I'm talking about. Now, this is Virginia Steen McIntyre, an American geologist. You know, she was involved in dating an archaeological site in Mexico called Huayatlaco. It's in central Mexico near the town of Puebla. There, a team of American archaeologists uncovered artifacts at this place. This is the excavation at Huayatlaco. It's a very professional excavation. The artifacts were photographed in the layers of rock in which they were found. And of course, the archaeologists wanted to know how old these things were, so they called a team of geologists to the site. Virginia Steen McIntyre and her colleagues used 4 methods for dating the site. I'll mention a couple of them here. They used the uranium series method to date animal bones with butchering marks, which were found in the same layers as the stone tools. They got ages up to 245,000 years using these methods. Above the layer of the stone tools and the butchered animal bones was a layer of volcanic ash. The geologists used the zircon fission track method to date that layer of ash and got an age of 270,000 years. Using all 4 methods that they employed, the geologists concluded the site must be at least 250,000 years old. The archaeologists said that is impossible. According to their understanding, human beings capable of making the artifacts didn't exist anywhere in the world 250,000 years ago. What to speak of North America? The current dominant consensus is there are no human beings in North America until 20,000 years ago at the earliest. So the archaeologists refused to publish the age for the site given by their own hand-picked team of geologists. This was quite surprising to Virginia Steen McIntyre and her colleagues. Therefore, they independently published the age for the site in a professional journal. When they did that, they experienced an extreme negative backlash from their colleagues because they had dared to publish something that contradicted the dominant consensus on human antiquity. And Virginia Steen McIntyre wrote to one of the editors of the journal, not being an anthropologist, I didn't realize how deeply woven into our thought the current theory of human evolution has become. Our work at Huayalaco has been rejected by most archaeologists because it contradicts that theory, period. So some of the cases I'm going to mention are from the more recent history of archaeology and some from the more older history of archaeology. This is a case from the earlier history of archaeology. This is Jacques Boucher de Pere, who was one of the founders of modern archaeology. He made an interesting discovery at a place called Moulin-Quignon, near Abbeville in northeastern France. He found in an excavation an anatomically modern human jaw. He found it in this layer of his excavation along with many stone tools and weapons. According to modern geologists, that layer at Moulin-Quignon is about 430,000 years old. At the time in the 19th century when the discovery was made, it was quite controversial. Many scientists did not believe that the human jaw was as old as the layer in which it was found. They thought it was simply impossible, so some of them proposed an explanation. They proposed, well, perhaps someone went to a nearby Roman cemetery, took a jaw from the Roman cemetery a couple thousand years old, and buried it in the excavation for Boucher de Pere to find. And actually that's the explanation that we see in the textbooks today. What we don't read in the textbooks today is that Boucher de Pere made, after these accusations were made, Boucher de Pere made additional excavations in the same site under conditions that completely ruled out the hoax hypothesis. And in these additional excavations, he recovered from the same formation over 100 additional anatomically modern human bones and teeth. Now, I had to dig into the original 19th century reports to find out about that. But I think those new discoveries verify the original one. And I would say what we have here is evidence for an anatomically modern human presence going back over 400,000 years in Northern Europe. I presented a paper on this topic at the 20th International Congress for History of Science, and that paper was later published in the peer-reviewed conference proceedings volume. In the early 20th century, an interesting discovery was made in Buenos Aires. An anatomically modern human skull cap was found there in an excavation. The excavation had gone down about 45 feet. At that level, they encountered a thick layer of limestone rock, locally known as Tosca, that's the name for it. And when they broke through that layer of limestone rock, the skull was found in what is called the Praensonaden Formation. And according to modern geologists, that formation is at least 1.5 million years old. This discovery was reported to the scientific world in the primary scientific literature by prominent South American scientist Florentino Ameghino. I wrote about that particular case in a paper that I presented at the meeting of the World Archeological Congress held in Cape Town, South Africa in 1999. A lot of people have heard about Olduvai Gorge, where some important archaeological discoveries have been made. Many people are not aware of the first discovery that was made at Olduvai Gorge, and that was a human skeleton that was found by the German scientist Hans Reck in 1913. Pictured is the skull from the skeleton. The skeleton was found solidly embedded in upper bed 2 of Olduvai Gorge. Rex said he had to use a hammer and chisel to get it out of those layers of rock. It was the skeleton was laid out parallel to the bedding planes of the rock, indicating it had been placed there originally. It wasn't a later burial. It was a very controversial discovery. Upper bed 2 is over 1.15 million years old, according to modern geologists. There were decades of debate about this discovery. Many scientists thought the debate was finally settled in the 1970s when a German researcher, Rainer Koch, did a radiocarbon dating of a fragment of bone he said was from the original skeleton and got an age of less than 10,000 years for it. So many people thought that settled the whole issue. However, I have a couple of problems with that. First of all, Rex skeleton was lost during World War II. It was being kept in a German museum that was firebombed during World War II. What Rex did is he said he found in another museum somewhere a box that contained some slivers of bone that he said were from the original skeleton. Whether they were or not, I don't think we can say. Another problem is that Rainer Proch was forced to resign his position at Frankfurt University after an academic court there found him guilty of falsifying dozens of radiocarbon dates during his long career. So I don't know that a radiocarbon date on a fragment of bone that may not have really belonged to the original skeleton carried out by Reiner Kroch really did resolve the issue. I think the best evidence for the age of Rex skeleton remains the report of the original investigator. In 1867, the Anthropological Review published a report by Dr. Robert H. Collier about an anatomically human jaw that was found 16 feet deep in the Red Crag Formation at a place called Foxhall in England. Foxhall is located in eastern England near the town of Ipswich. According to modern geologists, the Red Crag Formation is late Pliocene, between 2 and 3 million years old. Coming to the more recent history of archaeology, in 1979, Mary Leakey announced the discovery of footprints at a place called Lake Holi in the country of Tanzania in East Africa. The footprints were found in layers of solidified volcanic ash, 3,700,000 years old. The ash was dated using the potassium-argon method. In her original report, Mary Leakey said the footprints are indistinguishable from modern human footprints. Other scientists also agreed. Paleontologist Tim White wrote, make no mistake about it, they are like modern human footprints. Now, neither Mary Leakey nor Tim White believed human beings like us made those footprints. So how did they explain them? Well, they proposed there must have been some kind of hominid, some type of ape man who had feet exactly like modern human feet, and that's how the footprints were made. It's an interesting proposal. There isn't any physical evidence to really support that. We have skeletons of the ape men that existed during that time period. They were of the genus Australopithecus. In a place called Sterkfontein in South Africa, a foot skeleton of Australopithecus was discovered. And that foot skeleton is not exactly like that of a modern human being. It's more like that of a bonobo, which is a type of chimpanzee, with long toes and a first toe that can move out to the side like a human thumb. Actually, the only creature known to science today that has a foot exactly like that of a modern human being is a human being like ourselves. So, what did Mary Leakey actually find? I think we have to remain open to the possibility that she found evidence that humans like us were present between 3 and 4 million years ago in Africa. Or some people might say, I'll just mention I discussed this case in this paper presented at a meeting of the European Association of Archaeologists held in 1999 in the United Kingdom. And the reason I'm mentioning these papers is because sometimes some will say, well, this kind of stuff just isn't part of the current discourse in these disciplines. Well, it is part of the current discourse. Of course, it's a minority voice, an extreme minority voice. It's certainly not the majority voice, but it is part of the discourse. So, some might say, okay, footprints are a little bit ambiguous. It would be better if you had human skeletal remains that are 3 or 4 million years old. And such things do occur in the primary scientific literature. For example, in the 19th century, the Italian geologist Giuseppe Ragazzoni found human skeletons at a place called Castanedolo in northern Italy. He found them in middle Pliocene formations between 3 and 4 million years old, according to modern geologists. I went to Castanedolo And I met this gentleman there, and he gave me a copy of a very rare 19th century geological report that deals with this discovery. From the information in the report, we were able to determine the exact location where the discovery was originally made. And it should be possible to do more research there. Now, when some scientists hear that a human skeleton, an anatomically modern human skeleton, has been found in layers of rock 4 million years old, they assume something has got to be wrong here. It's actually, they would say it's very easy to explain. Maybe 4,000 years ago, someone died on the surface there. His friends dug a grave and put the body into the ancient layer of rock, and that's why you think you have a report of a human skeleton 4 million years old. Now, such things can happen. They do happen. Technically called, this is intrusive burial. But Ragazzoni, being a professional geologist, was very much aware of this problem, and he addresses this problem in his report. He pointed out that if it had been a burial, then the overlying layers of rock would have been disturbed, as we see here. But he said he conducted his excavation very carefully. He could see that all the overlying layers of rock were intact and undisturbed. Actually, he said each layer of rock had its own microstratification, that was undisturbed, showing there had been no earth movements or fissures, which would have taken some relatively recent bones down into those ancient layers. This is Carlos Ribeiro, who was the chief government geologist of Portugal in the late 19th century. He found hundreds of human artifacts in his country of Portugal. He found them in Miocene formations about 20 million years old, and as a professional geologist, he said they were in situ, they were intact in those layers. They hadn't come in through any fissures or earth movements or anything of that sort. They were in their natural position in these Miocene formations, which modern geologists tell us are about 20 million years old. He displayed the artifacts in these cases in the Museum of Geology in Lisbon. I'm kind of looking at those cases, but the artifacts aren't in those cases today. Today they're kept locked in these cabinets down here. But I got permission from the director of the museum to open up those cabinets, and I was able to study and photograph some of these very old human artifacts from Portugal. Here are some of them. I also studied Ribeiro's original field notes and maps. And after doing that, I went into the countryside of Portugal to relocate some of the places where he made his discoveries. This is the quarry at Morganheira, where he found human artifacts in Miocene formations about 20 million years old. This is one of the artifacts that he found there. It's a flint implement. It's got a nice point on it with use marks. It's interesting what happened. When Ribeiro was alive, he displayed these artifacts in the museum with labels indicating an age of about 20 million years. After he died, his colleagues did something interesting. They left the artifacts on display, but they wrote new labels for them, giving them far younger ages. This is the new label they wrote for the artifact I just showed you. It says, the second line gives the age. It says Paleolitico Superior. That means upper Paleolithic period. And according to archaeologists, that period in Europe goes back about 20,000 years or so. So they thought 20 million years, that's clearly impossible. 20,000 years sounds better, about right for artifacts like these. So they wrote new labels for all of the artifacts. Then the next generation of officials in the museum just put the entire collection away, new labels and all. I presented a paper on this case at a meeting of the European Association of Archaeologists that took place in Lisbon in the year 2000. Thought that would be a good place to do this. And that paper was later published in a peer-reviewed archaeological journal, the Journal of Iberian Archaeology, which deals with the archaeology of Spain and Portugal. People ask, do you have peer-reviewed publications and professional literature? The answer is yes. A case that's always really fascinated me is the California gold mine discoveries. In the 19th century, gold was discovered not far from here in California. Miners went to get the gold. They went to places like Table Mountain in Tuolumne County near Sonora. And to get the gold, they were digging tunnels into the sides of mountains. And deep inside the tunnels, miners found human bones and human artifacts. For example, they found many of these stone mortars and pestles in layers of solid rock that modern geologists tell us belong to the early Eocene period, which means they would be about 50 million years old. Just a little technical information about the dating. What we have here is the bedrock. These are ancient river channels. They're filled now with layers of rock that contain plant and animal fossils characteristic of the early Eocene period. The human bones and human artifacts were found in these same ancient river channels. The ancient river channels are covered with hundreds of feet of volcanic deposits that have been dated using the potassium argon method, as being up to 33 million years old. So that's where the dating comes from. These discoveries were first reported to the scientific world by Dr. J.B. Whitney, who was the chief government geologist of California. His report was published by Harvard University's Museum of Comparative Zoology in the year 1880. But we do not hear very much about these discoveries today. Certainly they're not mentioned in the textbooks. That's because of the process of knowledge filtration that I was speaking about earlier. This is the anthropologist William Holmes, who worked at the Smithsonian Institution. And he wrote in one of his reports, if Dr. Whitney had understood the theory of human evolution, he wouldn't have come to those conclusions, despite the imposing array of testimony with which he was confronted. Let me translate that. If the facts don't support the theory, the dominant theory, the facts should be forgotten, set aside, cast into oblivion. And basically that's what happened. However, some years ago, I was a consultant for a documentary that aired on NBC called The Mysterious Origins of Man. It was produced by Bill Cote. Bill Cote had read my book, Forbidden Archaeology, and he wanted to include some cases from the book in the documentary. So I told him he should go to the Museum of Anthropology at University of California at Berkeley, because I knew that some of the artifacts from the California gold mines are still in the collection of that museum. So Bill Cote went there, but they would not let him see or film the artifacts. We were able to find some photographs that Dr. Whitney had taken in the 19th century, so he did wind up with some imagery to use in the documentary, which included not just examples from my work, but from the work of other researchers in the alternative history field. It was interesting what happened when some of the more conservative members of the scientific community learned that NBC was going to broadcast this show. They actually tried to stop NBC from showing it. That wasn't successful, so then they went to the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, and tried to get the FCC to censure NBC, investigate NBC. You know, they wanted the FCC to force NBC to broadcast primetime apologies for having shown the program. And they also wanted NBC fined a few $1 million to teach them a good lesson. Now, I'm happy to say that the FCC didn't do any of that, but I thought it was interesting that these kinds of attempts were made. Now, after that, I proposed to present a paper on this case at a meeting of the World Archaeological Congress. So I submitted an abstract, and the academic committee of the Congress accepted the abstract. So I was able to go to the Museum of Anthropology at UC Berkeley with that letter of acceptance, and they decided they would let me personally see the artifacts. They're not kept in the museum, they're kept in a storage building a few miles from the museum, but you know, they are still there. And I also went out into the Sierra Nevada mountains. This is Table Mountain as it looks today, and we were able to locate some of the old 19th century gold mining tunnels where these things were originally discovered. So this is the paper that I presented on this case at the World Archaeological Congress meeting that was held in Washington, D.C. in 2003. And again, you know, the only reason I'm mentioning this is that some people want to claim this sort of thing isn't part of the current discourse. Well, it is. So how far back in time can we go with evidence like this as we make our way through the primary scientific literature? Well, there was an interesting report published in The Geologist in the year 1862. An anatomically modern human skeleton was found 90 feet below the surface of the ground in Macoupin County in the state of Illinois in America. According to the report, above the skeleton was a thick layer of slate rock that extended for hundreds of yards in all directions, and that layer of rock was unbroken. According to modern geologists of the State Geological Survey of Illinois, at that location, the layers beneath the slate rock are about 300 million years old. This interesting report from Scientific American tells of a beautiful metallic vase that was recovered from 15 feet deep in solid rock in Dorchester near Boston. And according to geologists of the United States Geological Survey, the age of the formation at that depth, at that point, at that location, is about 600 million years. So I could keep you here from now until Christmas, you know, going through one case after another, because there are hundreds of these cases in the primary scientific literature on human origins. But I'm not going to do that. But I will just say that the implication of this evidence is that this more or less generally accepted picture of human origins may not represent the actual truth of the matter. And you know, this was something that was recognized by one of the architects of this modern version of human origins, Dr. William W. Howells, who read Forbidden Archaeology shortly after it was published, and he was kind enough to write me a letter. And he wrote, Forbidden Archaeology represents much careful effort in critically assembling published materials, which I thought was nice of him to acknowledge. And because many academics and scientists don't see it that way, but I thought it was nice that he did. And he went on to say most of us in the world of human origin studies, mistakenly or not, see human evolution with man emerging rather late. That's a factual statement. And to have modern human beings appearing a great deal earlier would be devastating, not just to our account of human origins, but to the whole theory of evolution. So I thought it was nice that somebody recognized the implications of what was being presented in that book. Another person who recognized the implications was Tim Murray, who wrote a review of Forbidden Archaeology in British Journal for History of Science. And he wrote, Forbidden Archaeology provides the historian of archaeology with a useful compendium of case studies in the history and sociology of scientific knowledge, which can be used to foster debate within archaeology about how to describe the epistemology of one's discipline. And that's exactly what I was trying to accomplish in putting that book together, to inspire debate in archaeology about the epistemology of the discipline. So I think it was significant that a professional archaeologist read the book and got that message from it. It was exactly the message I was intending to send. He went on to say, Forbidden Archaeology is designed to demolish the case for biological and cultural evolution and to advance the cause of a Vedic alternative. 100% correct. And I thought it was nice of him to recognize that, acknowledge it, and succinctly express it in his review. Now, it's when we get to the phrase Vedic alternative that alarm bells start going off in the minds of many. Because here many will see, well, here's an attempt to sneak religion into science, and that is absolutely forbidden. It just should not be allowed, not in the slightest. So, Murray went on to say something very interesting. He wrote, the quote, dominant paradigm in archaeology has changed and is changing, and practitioners openly debate issues which go right to the conceptual core of the discipline. Whether the Vedas have a role to play in this is up to the individual scientist concerned. Now that is a statement that I 100% absolutely agree with. Some people want to make an a priori rule that you cannot bring the Vedas or any other spiritually inspired idea into the world of science. So I disagree with that idea. I agree with this idea. It should be up to each individual science or science teacher whether or not to grant a role to ideas that may have some source in the Vedas, the Quran, the Bible, the Native American teachings, Australian Aboriginal teachings, whatever. Of course, with the qualification that they have to be justified with scientific evidence and logic. So that's a position that I can 100% support. And I would 100% disagree with those who want to say such things should be totally excluded a priori. Now I'm going to wrap this up by giving some personal experiences of presenting these things to university audiences. My books are now published in 20 different languages, more than 20 different languages. One of them is Russian. So I've been invited to Russia several times. I've spoken at universities from one end of the country to the other, from St. Petersburg to Moscow to Vladivostok and back again. And mostly the lectures go fine. But sometimes, one or two places there have been some problems. This is the Tumen State University in Russia, and some professors there invited me to speak about my work, and a lecture was scheduled. But the day before the lecture, the president of the university canceled the lecture because of pressure from faculty members, other faculty members, who did not want me to speak there. They objected to me speaking for two reasons. First of all, I was questioning the dominant theory of human origins, the Darwinian evolutionary theory. And second, and perhaps even more unforgivingly, I was doing it from a Vedic perspective. So either one of them probably would have been enough to inspire these professors to approach the administration and get them to cancel the lecture. So the professors who invited me went to the president of the university and tried to get him to change his mind, but he wouldn't. So then the professors who invited me went to the local branch of the Russian Academy of Science, and they spoke to the director there. And he said, okay, if they won't let him speak at the university, he can speak here. And nobody will put any pressure on me to cancel his lecture. So they had buses bring students and professors from the university to the Russian Academy of Science building, and the lecture was held there. And the professors who invited me said, more people came than would have come if the lecture had been held at the university. Because everybody was wondering, what's this guy going to say that's so dangerous? Then the next year, I went back to the same university, and I spoke in the biology department there, no problem. I guess they decided, better just let me talk and let students make up their minds, what they're going to think about what I'm saying. And this doesn't just happen in Russia. Last year, I did a lecture tour of universities in the Midwestern United States. I spoke at Penn State. I spoke at Northwestern in Chicago, University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, University of Illinois, Carbondale, University of Minnesota, a whole bunch of, about a dozen or 15 universities in the Midwestern states. But at one university, University of Indiana in Bloomington, same thing happened as in Russia. A lecture was scheduled, announced, and faculty members who don't appreciate the kind of thing that I'm saying got wind and put pressure on the administration, and the lecture was canceled. Unfortunately, there wasn't a local branch of the Russian Academy of Science for me to go to. So the lecture was held in the city library. It was well attended. So I want to thank you for your kind attention, and if you're interested in pursuing these ideas, there's some books of mine here. As far as the organizers are concerned, what should we do now? Is there time for...
Yeah, we can have question and answer session.
Okay.
10 minutes.
Okay, 10 minutes of questions and answers. So there isn't a microphone.
Please raise your hand in case you have a question and the mic will come to you.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Shayo. I'm a mechanical engineering student here. So I had one concern that many of the fossil evidences you were showing were in the late 19th century or early 20th century, before the fields of geochronology and other like hominid fossil, how to recognize them was not fully developed. And so are those skeletons still in existence, and is it possible to actually independently radiocarbon them and see what the actual age of those skeletons are today? Because of those things are like 70 or 80 years old, it is kind of difficult to know what actually happened in situ there.
Okay, a few comments on what you said. First of all, I'm doing an historical survey of archaeological evidence, so I'm not looking at just the most recent discoveries. Second point is that if you look in any modern textbook of archaeology, you're not going to find just the most recent discoveries. You're going to find the Neanderthal discoveries that were made in the 19th century, the Java man discoveries that were made at the end of the 19th century, the Beijing man discoveries that were made in the early 20th century. So we can't just assume that all science done before January 1st, 1900 is automatically suspect. That's why, I found it very helpful to go back to the original reports and see what kinds of work were actually being done. Were the authors of the original investigations, the original investigators, were they taking into account these things? Now, new sources, new dating methods sometimes introduce new ways to make mistakes. That can also happen. So, in some cases, things are there. As you saw, I would go into the museums, I would locate objects that are in their collections. So, in these cases, it would be possible to go back and do new dating studies, apply new dating methods, and